Today, let's talk about Israel. Stay tuned, everybody.
Hey, for the best meat you have ever eaten, check out samsbutchershop.com. Go and shop around. When you go to checkout, enter the promo code Triple T for a 5% discount. Check it out.
And a good Monday to you all, everyone. This is Trailer Trash Tim. How's your mom and them? Welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I thought that today that I would like to take a few minutes on the show and try and squeeze into a few minutes something that I could spend hours or days or weeks on, quite frankly. But I think it's important. I've been talking a lot about, of course, the war, this particular war having to do with Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas and all that. But I want to give a little context to what's happening in that region of the world by rolling back the clock and taking a closer look at the nation/state of Israel and Palestine and where they came from, where this nation came from, talk about its history and where it is today, where it came from, why it exists, who the inhabitants are, and thus and so. And also, I'm going to have to inject the component of religion into this discussion because the subject of religion, in particular, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, into an understanding of Israel, because you really can't tell the story without touching on religion. And I'm going to intertwine that with some religious thought in the West that affects the way that so many people feel in the West about this state of Israel. So bear with me and let's get going. Let's go back to the very beginning. Now, Israel has always, or it began rather, as a Jewish nation. The land became known as Palestine, was founded about the year 1700 BC, and we have biblical accounts of this. It was a patriarchal beginning with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God gave this land to these patriarchs who settled in the land of what was called Canaan. And this land became known as Israel, or the West Bank, what is now known as the West Bank of the Gaza Strip, parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And it came to be known from that time as the Promised Land, Israel, Lebanon, I'm sorry, not Lebanon, the Palestinian region, or the Holy Land. It was also called the Holy Land. So that's the way it was for about 700 years. And about the year 1000 BC began the monarchy, the time of the monarchs in Israel, and that began with King Saul. And King Saul was succeeded by David, King David, and David was succeeded by, of course, his son Solomon. David was the king who made Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and Solomon, of course, is the one who built the temple, Solomon's temple. Now, after the death of Solomon, the united monarchy was split in half. You had the northern kingdom and you had the southern kingdom. And the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, and the capital of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. And this whole region was mostly populated by Jews, but their number began to diminish because of various conquests that happened over the next several hundred years. In the about 63 BC was the conquest of Rome. Rome overran Israel, and they renamed. There were two kingdoms at that time. Remember, there was the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, and Rome renamed the kingdom of Judah Palestine, and that's where we get Palestinians. So as time went on, Of course, this was before the time of Christ, who eventually came, and he came when Christ came, when the incarnation occurred. Israel was under the rule of Rome. It was ostensibly part of the Roman Empire. So eventually, not to get bogged down, but as time went on, of course, the early Christians suffered a lot of persecution at the hands of various Roman emperors, such as Nero. But eventually, Christianity became the dominant religion, and this was like toward the end of the Roman Empire. Now, in the 7th century, specifically in the year 636, is when we see Islam raise its head. And Islam is very good at one thing, and that is conquest. And that's what happened. Islam began to expand in the Middle East, and it set its sights on Jerusalem. And eventually, of course, it made such inroads that the city of Jerusalem became the epicenter, if you will, for 3 religions, for Judaism, for Christianity, and as well for Islam. And it continued this way. In the 16th century, this whole region was ruled finally by the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire. And it stayed that way up until about the First World War in 1917. But this land was still known by that time as, generally speaking, as Palestine. And that's where we get, of course, Palestinians from. Now, we move on into the 20th century, and this is when Jewish people were in search of their own homeland, and they set their sights on Israel, and many Jews began to move back into what was historically known as the Holy Land, because they were Zionists. They believed this to be their land. But of course, already there were the Palestinians. So as the Jews began to move it back into the area, you had this Jewish and Arab conflict, which exists, of course, to this day. But a lot of this is religious in nature, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment, because it's really all throughout the story. It's unavoidable. But anyway, they began to seek to claim Israel as their homeland. Then World War I broke out and really exploded, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. That was a good thing. And the land of Israel/Palestine fell under British rule, and it became known as the British Mandate for Palestine. In 1923, Britain promised to establish a Jewish national homeland under its Balfour Declaration. And so tensions then between the Jews and the Arabs, who of course were already there, the Palestinians who were already there, this tension began to escalate, and it led to a lot of violence. And after the Second World War, more Jews fled Europe to Palestine, and this further escalated the tension with the Arabs. Now, just imagine for a moment, if you can, if you have lived in a particular place your whole life, and all of a sudden somebody comes and says, "Oh, by the way, this is our land now." How would you feel? That's kind of how the Palestinians felt, and I can understand that. Maybe you can as well. Now, in 1947, the United Nations drew up a plan to partition Palestine into 2 independent states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And the city of Jerusalem was declared an international zone. And this was problematic because roughly a third of the population at this time of Jerusalem was Jewish, yet they were granted 56% of the land by the United Nations. And this did not sit well with the Arabs that were already there. Now, in 1948, Israel declared itself an independent state. This was in 1948, and this further increased the struggles between the Jews and the Arabs. And then there was a war in 1948 called the Arab-Israeli War. And this was between the Jews and the Arab League. That was Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq, and they invaded and they unified their front in Arab Palestine, and then there was a ceasefire in 1948. And the UN stepped in and they tried to divide up Israel, and they tried to divide up Jerusalem, and they've tinkered with it actually to this day. And of course, all we've had are just more and more wars. There was the big 6-day war, of course, in 1967. That was Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Israel. Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. Israel prevailed in that war, and they took over the West Bank, the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem from Jordan, who did hold it at that time, and they took Gaza from Egypt, and they also took the Sinai Peninsula, but they eventually gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt after they signed a peace treaty. And after the war, Israel forced native Palestinians. This is important. Please get this. After that war, Israel forced native Palestinians from their homes, and they relocated them to the Gaza Strip and Lebanon, the West Bank, Syria, and Jordan. And it was this rising number of Jews in Israel which gave rise to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which you undoubtedly have heard of. And of course, the PLO represented the Palestinian, the people who were the natives of the land, the Palestinians, until their political defeat by a group that was trained in Israel by the American CIA, and that was a group, the Israeli-trained group called Hamas. And that's who Israel is having problems with today. Now, I want to revisit this issue of Israel from a religious point of view, particularly from the view of Christianity. I touched on this some last week, and I got quite a few emails and what have you, and even snail mails from evangelicals with various opinions on this topic. So I want to address it again and make it clear. And I realize I normally don't cover things like this on my channel. I don't really want it to be about this. But when you're talking about the state of Israel and all that's going on there today, there's no way to avoid the issue of religion. There's a lot of YouTube channels, there's a lot of media outlets that cover the peripherals of the war, but I'm telling you at the root of this, it is a religious war, and there's as probably most wars are, and there's simply no way around this. Now, the war that's going on right now between Israel and Hamas, this is a conflict largely between the Jewish people and Muslims. In this region of the world, in Israel, in Palestine, that whole region, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, that whole Middle Eastern area, there is just an influx of Jewish people, of Muslim people, of adherents to Islam, and in there somewhere are Christians who are trying to just live out their Christian life as best they can, and they're often just caught up in this crossfire. But I want to address again this issue of Israel from the perspective that so many American evangelicals see it, because I tried to touch on this the other day, and it's really important to understand the roots of Zionism and the roots of the evangelical fundamentalist thought with regard to the nation-state of Israel, which is inconsistent, I maintain, with traditional Christian doctrine and thought. And I want to point that out further today so that hopefully we can come to a better understanding of the situation. Because, as we know in America, I pointed this out the other day, you've got all sorts of Christian groups. You've got the Orthodox Church, of which I am a member. We maintain this is the church Christ founded. Then you have the Roman Catholic Church, which split from the Orthodox Church in the year 1054. over the Filioque clause and papal supremacy and issues such as that. And then, of course, you had the Protestant Revolution in the 1500s, begun by Martin Luther, a former Catholic priest. And from that Protestant Revolution came a landslide of Protestant denominations, groups, movements, and sects, S-E-C-T-S, that have spread throughout the West. And a subset in the landslide of denominations would be evangelical fundamentalist, which many of these groups kind of sprung from the Methodist denomination, some from the Baptist denomination, but you have this group mostly in the West called evangelical fundamentalist. This would also include groups that are called charismatics. These groups are largely, I've already maintained they are evangelical fundamentalist, but I want to address what they believe about the state of Israel and hopefully show how what they believe is inconsistent, at least, with what Christianity has always taught with regard to the nation state of Israel. Now, what evangelicals believe is a brand of thought, a line of thought called dispensationalism. Now let's talk about dispensationalism for a moment. Dispensationalism is a form, of premillennialism, which narrates biblical history as a number of successive economies or administrations called dispensations. Dispensationalism was developed by the Plymouth Brethren movement and the teachings of a man by the name of John Nelson Darby in the latter half of the 1800s, largely in Ireland. So this thought has not been around all that long. And dispensationalism and premillennialism was brought to the United States of America by a man by the name of John Inglis, and it flourished then through the teachings of Dwight L. Moody and C.I. Schofield, who I referenced last week in a show that I did. Now, what is it that dispensationalism teaches it, and that evangelical fundamentalists adhere to and most charismatics adhere to? It simply teaches things such as the rapture, and it teaches things as, with regard to Israel, dispensationalists believe that the Jewish nation or the Jewish people are God's chosen people on the earth, and that they are somehow God's elect, and that God has a plan for the Jewish people that will culminate at the end of history. They believe that Christ will come back one day to Jerusalem and set up his kingdom on earth, and he will gather the dispersed or the Jewish people to his side. Now, indeed, it must be said, the church does teach that some Jews will convert to Christ. That will happen, and some Jews have already converted to Christ and have been received into his church, the Orthodox Church, and that's a very good thing. The Apostle Paul talked about some of these Jews who were known as Judaizers. Some of these would say they followed Christ, yet they kept a lot of the Jewish customs. And Paul addressed this in the book of Galatians and told them, put all that away. You're in the church now, and we do things our particular way. What happens with regard to evangelical fundamentalism is simply this. When you are raised in a particular manner and with a particular mindset and with particular teachings, religious teachings, this forms your context. This is how you see things. I personally was raised as an evangelical, and that's the world that I knew in terms of Christianity. That's what I knew, and that's all that I knew. That was my reference point. That's how I understood the Christian faith. It wasn't until years later that I began to understand, wait a minute, there was Christianity before the 1800s. Now, as I told you, this strain of dispensationalism only started in the late 1800s. There is about 1,800 more years of Christianity to reference from where this was never taught. Dispensationalism was never taught. Premillennialism was never taught. And this notion that the Jews are somehow God's chosen, the elect of God, and he's going to gather the dispersed one day back to his chosen land of Israel, and he's going to establish his kingdom there with the Jews, his chosen race. This was never taught prior to the late 1800s. Does that not tell you something? It should. But we get these preconceived notions from our upbringings, and it's all we know, and that's all we can reference from. And we get so inculcated and indoctrinated by these teachings, just assuming, well, this is what I've always been taught, so it must be right. But maybe it isn't right. The thing that I began to do in my life many years ago was to begin to study the early church fathers and to study the early writings of the church and to understand that Christ founded a church, one church, not thousands of churches. And I began to study that, and I began to understand that what I believed as an evangelical was at wide variance with what Christians had historically always believed. So something had to give. Either they were all wrong or I was wrong, and I had to change, and that's what happened. So dispensationalists, evangelical fundamentalists, believe that the Jews and the state of Israel is God's chosen and God's elect. But folks, this is simply not the case. The nation, as I tried to point out the other day, the church teaches, Christianity teaches, that Israel is now a reference to the church. The church, Christians, are the Israel of God, not the Jewish people, not the plot of dirt in the Middle East known as Israel. It simply is not. It's just another nation. Now, there are a lot of holy sites in the state of Israel. This is where Christ was born. This is where he was crucified. This is where he rose from the dead, we believe, and many miracles were done here. So it is a holy land, but it is not a land that is set aside to be the land, the elect land, where God's elect are going to be gathered back to him. That's simply not the case at all. It never was. Let me give to you something from the scriptures that the Lord told to the Jews. This is from a gospel account in Matthew. This is chapter 21 and 43. When he addresses the Jewish people, and he says this, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it." He's talking to the Jews and telling them what's going to happen. Why? Because they rejected him. That's why. And they said, "Let his blood be on our head." And that's exactly what happened. Now, the Apostle Paul, St. Paul, wrote to the people in Galatia. This was a church that is now in present-day Turkey, and it was a mixture of Christians. They were Christians, but it was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, and they were having a problem with Judaizers. And he said this, "If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." He did not say, "If you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed." He did not say, "If you are a Jew, you are Abraham's seed." Didn't happen. As I tried to explain the other day, when the Jews rejected Christ, as they did, and they rejected all of his prophets, Christ rejected them. They are not the chosen people of God. They simply are not. Who is? Who is that royal priesthood, that holy nation? It's the church. It's Christians. That's who he's talking about now. The Jews rejected Christ and they killed Christ. And nothing good happened to them as a result. So for dispensationalists to believe that Israel is somehow some chosen land of God is simply in error. It is simply not the case. Israel is the church. It is not a plot of dirt. Israel can be anywhere on the earth. If you are of Christ, you are of him, and you are heirs according to the promise, according to Abraham's seed. You are the Israel of God if you are in the church, not the Jewish people. They have no special favor any longer. So, what's going to happen in this war between Israel and Hamas? Is it possible that Israel could lose this war? That Israel could fall? I maintain it is possible. And if it does happen, and I'm not saying it will, maybe it won't, but if it does, it's going to greatly shake the faith of evangelical fundamentalists and dispensationalists who don't think something like that could possibly happen. It could happen. I don't know if it will happen. I don't know what's going to happen in this war. But if you are a Christian, your allegiance needs to be to Christ, not to the Jewish people who rejected Christ. Now, they can accept Christ, except, quote unquote, that is to say they can come into the church, they can come into the Orthodox Church and repent of their errors and become members of the body of Christ once again. But I hope that clarifies the issue of Israel and perhaps of Palestine, because it also needs to further be said that the people in Israel who claim this to be their land have committed atrocities against the Palestinian people with American support and American weapons. They have essentially shut off power and water to the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people are helpless. They live on a little strip of land called Gaza because the Jews in Israel drove them out of there, and now they're basically starving them. These are Jewish atrocities, and these are the people that people like John Hagee support and claim that these are God's chosen people. It is absolute heresy. It is simply not the case at all. The Jews are not God's chosen people, folks. Christians are God's chosen people now, and it's as simple as that. And we should pay no mind to dispensationalists, and we should, if you are a dispensationalist, you should reject this. If you're an evangelical fundamentalist, you need to think long and hard about what you're believing. You need to understand this has never in the history of Christendom been taught anywhere until the late 1800s. It's time for you to review that and take another look at it. And if you hear other voices that tell you otherwise, it's time to look at the truth. It's time to look at the truth. Give me a big thumbs up on this video, if you will, below. I appreciate that. If you have not yet subscribed to the Trailer Trash Tim channel, you may do so below, as long as you're not an illegal alien, as long as you do not wear a face mask. You are welcome to join our growing community. I really avoided having to touch on the issue of religion specifically, Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity, but it's really unavoidable when you're talking about Israel because there's just so much bad information out there about it. I did my best to make things clear. I hope I did. But whatever the case, give me your comments down below. I would very much appreciate hearing from you all. Thank you so much for joining me on this wonderful Monday. Everybody go out there, have a tremendous day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.